and maybe some precautions as well.
Yeah. So one of the easiest ways is a sigil. So a sigil is a word that means symbol, and you think of a phrase that encapsulates what it is that you want. You take the first letter and you write those letters down, and then you move them around to create a shape, some kind of symbol that stands for your intention. There's lots of different things you can do. You could create that picture.
If I wanted to manifest a conversation with Dean Radin, would this be a good example?
And so that you can find apps on phones where you type in something and it'll create a sigil for you. I don't recommend that as much as actually taking the effort to do it yourself, and to be creative about how it looks. And for some people, they like it to look pleasant to look at or meaningful in some way, because you're using your intention in the process of doing that. So once you create the sigil, there's several things you can do. One approach is to make copies of it and paste them all over the place so that you're constantly reminded that you made this thing.
Get it into your subconscious.
Yeah, like put it on your mirror that you see in the morning, things like that, so you're reminded of this. The conscious part of it is creating the sigil itself and so-called charging the sigil with that intention. And you don't want to dwell on it too much, because none of this happens through your conscious awareness. It happens once it becomes really deep into your unconscious. So you spend a fair amount of time making the sigil, thinking about it, and then you set it aside. I mean, it still could be up on your mirror, but you're not looking at your mirror all day long. So you don't dwell on it, you set it out there and just let it go. You also don't need to think about how your intention will manifest, right? I'll give an example here if I can find it. Yeah, so one of the examples I give is you have an intention to get a gold-plated Mercedes. And so you don't care how that happens. You just want it to show up in your driveway and you are the owner of this gold-plated Mercedes. Well, if you start thinking about what needs to happen in the real world for that to occur, you'll stop yourself immediately.
Yeah, that's what we would call like the linear thinking.
Well, it's not only linear thinking, but it's self-questioning. You inject doubt into the intention, and that destroys the intention. So you need to intend this and say, look, I don't care how this is going to happen. I just want this to happen. Universe, you figure it out somehow. And it may work tomorrow, it may make 10 years to have it happen, but it'll happen. When you have your intention, it has to be absolutely crystal clear,
very specific,
about what you mean by that. And I have found again and again in my life that when I had a very strong intention about something, the clearer the intention was, two things would happen. First of all, it would happen, but the faster it would happen was related to how clear it was. So very clear intention, I need this for what I'm doing, just seems to appear. So the flip side of all this is sometimes if you look at a grimoire, which is a book of spells used in traditional magic, a huge section of that is going to be on love magic. So it's to find somebody for love, for sex, for relationship, whatever. That is a gray area, because if you override the free will of somebody else, that's considered black magic. Yes. Black magic is considered not a very good thing because of something like karma. That you override somebody else's free will, you are opening a door that you don't want to go through. So this is like every tradition has this same warning. So be very careful then in using your intention so that you are not overriding somebody else's free will. That's rule number one, or causing harm to somebody else. So a gray area here that is a really interesting one from an ethical point of view is, what if you want to stop somebody else from hurting somebody else? Well, you're overriding that person's free will because they're going to do whatever they're going to do. But if they're a bad person and they're going to hurt somebody else, the way that the magical traditions deal with this is to create a binding spell. It has lots of different names to it, but the binding spell essentially is an intention that the person will not produce harm to another person. And it's a gray area because you are interfering with them, but in a good way. That's why, from an ethical perspective, it's interesting to discuss, well, should you do that or not? I don't know, probably case by case, you have to decide, is this worth doing? And like, you have to eat the karma from that or not. So I don't have any simple answer to that, but that is a consideration.
What would light magic look like in this case?
Generally, things like healing. Somebody is in need, gives you permission to heal them, because you don't want to, like if somebody doesn't ask for your help, you should not give it to them, because that it might be overriding their intention. Like some people say, don't deal with me at all, so don't do that. But if they're asking for help, then healing definitely is tradition of white magic, because you're helping. Or if it's simply that you're looking for information, like you want to make a decision about something, and it may or may not involve other people, but all you're asking for is information, that's okay as well. From the Western culture, magic consists of divination, knowing things about what's happening out there, force of will, which otherwise we thought it was psychokinetic effects, it's spell casting and so on, and then theurgy, which has to do with spirits, because all of the esoteric traditions assume that there are some kind of non-physical spirits out there. In the Eastern tradition, the same powers are thought about slightly differently, but they're called siddhis, which is a Sanskrit term that means essentially power. It's the same kind of idea. Sometimes it could be translated as attainment, like special attainment, but it's ultimately about different psychic abilities. So the Yoga Sutras is considered the classical book of yoga, at least 2,000 years ago, but it was part of an oral tradition that goes back so far we don't really know where it started from. And it was all about methods of meditation and deep states of mind, which they would call samadhi, which a magician would call gnosis. It's the same underlying deep mental state. That's where the magic comes from. That's where the siddhis come from, these deep mental states, which are generally in most people nowhere near a conscious level. It takes a lot of meditative experience or certain psychedelics to be able to drop into those states. So it's a non-ordinary state of awareness. The upshot is that from those deep states, it seems as though the difference between mind and matter, or everyday reality and some underlying sense of reality, is much more flexible than it is in your conscious awareness. So in the conscious awareness states, I want to levitate. Not happening. In these deep states, it would happen because you're able to manipulate elements of reality that we don't have access to at this level of awareness. So there's roughly 25 different kinds of siddhis that are mentioned in these ancient texts. The most elementary ones are, like the very first one that is mentioned, is the ability to perceive past, present, and future all at the same time. So today we'd call that somewhere between clairvoyance and precognition. And it goes all the way up to levitation, to invisibility, to super strength, to almost everything that you've seen in a comic book. But this was written thousands of years ago, not as a story, but as this will happen in these states. So from a modern perspective, you look back at that and say, well, this is so much like seeing a superhero movie that can't possibly be true. But there are historical cases of people levitating and doing all kinds of strange things that are mildly credible. We don't see those today in the laboratory. Like, we have never seen anybody actually levitate. I'd love to. So the idea is, so how do we evaluate the Yoga Sutras, given that it was so long ago? And the only way I can think of doing it then is saying, well, here's 25 or so different kinds of powers, simple elementary powers that many beginning meditators bump into are things like synchronicities and telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. We know those are real using modern scientific methods. So then the question would arise, well, if we know that roughly 6 to 10 of these 25 powers are real, were they simply making up the rest of them? I don't think so. I think that actually part of this lore that's been going on for probably tens of thousands of years, that people, probably a very small percentage of people, but some people can actually do those things. People who have those abilities are very likely not to want to be known for having those abilities, because they will immediately attract followers that they don't want, and they probably will put themselves and people they know in danger, right? Especially in the modern world, anybody who has that level of power will become a threat. There will be people out there who want to get the threat to go away. And so someone with that level of skill almost certainly will remain invisible. So remote viewing is a modern euphemism for clairvoyance. So perception through space and time. That's what the Stargate program was all about. And by the way, that was one code word of many different code words that were used over the years. The idea was if someone really can perceive through space and time, it might be useful for espionage. And that's what that project was about. So there's two sides. One was a research program, which is what I was on. The other was an operational program that was part of the Army unit. So there were people who were recruited to be remote viewers. Some of them were naturally good. Others were interested and turned out that they could be trained. And they were given I forget how many, 500 or 600 different missions, where their job was to use the remote viewing skills to give information to the intelligence community that would use the information as one piece of information, along with lots of other pieces of information. So in the intel business, you use satellites, you use human intelligence, you use everything you can think of to pull in information about a given event or thing that you want to know about, and then the analysts will kind of put it all together into a package. So I don't know of any cases where the psychic information was used only by itself. It was used as a composite. But sometimes the information was so unexpected that the analyst didn't know what to do with it, and it turned out to be true. So it turns out some people are quite talented at this. We had saw a couple of movies of people who were able to do small scale psychokinetic things. But by far, it was much, much easier to find people who are talented in clairvoyance. And so you think about what percentage of the population will have these skills. So something like 1 in 10,000 people will be quite good just naturally at clairvoyance or be able to be trained somewhat. And maybe 1 in a million or fewer will have some kind of psychokinetic talent. So, if you have millions of people in the army, you can do wide-scale searching for people and recruit them and then keep sifting down candidates until you end up with a small number who are very good.